Welcome back to The World This Week with me, Phil Rees. Well, he sounded like George Bush and Tony Blair rolled into one. David Cameron warned this week that we, whoever we means, of course, are facing an existential generational threat from Islamist terrorism. His remarks came after the attack by Islamist militants on a gas plant partly run by BP in eastern Algeria. As the death toll of foreign hostages rose sharply to about 37, I think the figure is now, there were questions about whether Algeria had taken all available steps to avert such bloody outcome. Algeria responded by claiming that the attack was blowback from the Arab Spring, that militant Islamism had been unleashed by the move to democracy in some states in the Middle East. One of those that has not had an Arab Spring, of course, is Algeria. Well, as French troops in nearby Mali expelled Islamist fighters from urban centres, the British Prime Minister raised the spectre of more Western military intervention to fight terrorism. Fabia Martin reports.
The UK is facing a generational struggle against Islamist-inspired terrorism, warned David Cameron this week. The Prime Minister's concerns over the influence of al-Qaeda in North Africa have been heightened following the deployment of French troops to tackle militant groups linked to the network in Mali, and a hostage crisis which began last Wednesday on this Algerian gas plant. During the siege, 37 foreigners of 8 nationalities, including Britain, Norway, France, Japan and Romania, were taken hostage. At least 69 people have now died, including 3 Britons, and the attack has been widely condemned.
We will work closely with the Algerian government to learn the lessons of this attack and to deepen our security cooperation. And we will contribute British intelligence and counter-terrorism assets to an international effort to find and dismantle the network that planned and ordered the brutal assault at In Amenas.
The group responsible for the incident in Algeria appears to have been led by this man, Mokhtar Belmokhtar. In this video, Belmokhtar claims that the assault in Algeria by his faction was conducted to avenge the French decision to attack northern Mali. The militants also accused Algeria of shutting its borders to Malian refugees and demanded the release of dozens of Islamists held in Algerian prisons. On Tuesday, as the conflict continued, the United Nations Security Council met, telling member states that more forces and money will be needed to combat militants in Mali, and the Malian ambassador thanked the international community for its support.
Je voudrais exprimer la gratitude des autorités maliennes à la CEDEAO, à l'Union africaine, à l'Union européenne, aux Nations unies, à nos partenaires bilatéraux ou multilatéraux, aux pays voisins et à tous les pays de la région pour leur accompagnement solidaire dans cette épreuve difficile que traverse mon pays. Je vous remercie.
But motives behind supporting involvement in Algeria, an unstable and oil-rich gateway between Africa and Europe, have also been questioned. And whilst international alliances against the Islamist threat appear to be growing, there are also fears of tension increasing as the West intervenes to solve problems in yet another Muslim country. With the ball already rolling and the West on high alert, could North Africa become the stage of the next Afghanistan? Fabia Martin, Islam Channel.
Well, in the studio today we have Nick Witney, a Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. Hamza Hamouchene is co-founder of the Algerian Solidarity Campaign, a UK-based organisation that campaigns for peaceful democratic change in Algeria. And 2 guests on the phone today, Paul Rogers, the Professor of Peace Studies at Bradford University, and Hicham Yessa, the editor of Ceasefire magazine, and he's also Algerian. Nick Witney, I mean, were you surprised by David Cameron's language today? I mean, obviously this was a tragic, a very bloody event in Algeria, resulting in a lot of death. But, I mean, were you surprised that he seemed to have sort of injected something into his veins?
Yes, I was. I thought it was excessive and over the top. And I don't think it helps to talk about what's going on in Mali and the wider Sahel in these rather simplistic terms of they're all terrorists and they're all al-Qaeda franchises or affiliates or whatever that means, and they're all therefore a threat to our Western way of life. I mean,
because it's not true, is it?
Well, I don't think it is true, no.
I think that's the first problem.
That is the first problem.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think we should close our eyes to the fact that there are obviously Islamist extremist groups running around in Mali who are doing unpleasant things to the local population. But there's also a great mix of kidnappers and drug runners and Tuareg nationalists, and it's a very messy situation there. So I personally think the French were right to. I think somebody needed to go in and stabilise a situation which was in danger of tipping over the edge. But I do think if the West is going to do that, it needs to do it incredibly carefully. And the lesson of Afghanistan is don't go out of your way to broaden the scope of your enemies. If you have enemies there, and maybe you do, target them as precisely as possible and don't go out of the way to make trouble with all sorts of other people who have different agendas and who are not part of some terrorist plot against the West.
Do you see all of this, Dr. Hamouchene, as a prelude to sort of another military front for the West? You've got Algeria saying, look, something's going to be done now. You've got the French just today guarding their uranium plant in Niger. Do you see this as part of another front, as we heard in Fabian Martin's report?
Yes, I think that this fight in terrorism is used just as a pretext to intervene and create another front for the global war on terror. For me, this discourse of protecting human rights and promoting democracy is just a big lie, because it's just enough to see how the West backed dictators for decades, including in Mali and Algeria, and how they are still supporting the most fundamentalist states, Saudi Arabia.
People of Britain, for example, from these fighters?
I wouldn't say it is an existential threat, because it's just maintaining this discourse of clash between civilizations.
Well, Tuareg fighters are hardly going to sort of invade London, are they?
No, they wouldn't. If you look at the historical record, these Western interventions do not bring stability nor install democratic regimes. Just look at what happened in Afghanistan, the destruction in Iraq. Look at how Libya became a center of exporting militants and weapons. To see that these neo-colonial expeditions are just ending up in creating a large network of terror from Pakistan to the Sahel, and they are just fueling violence.
But I mean, Paul Rogers, I suppose what's behind perhaps what the Prime Minister and others, and you know, the media that's kind of echoed this thought, is that the Arab Spring, and of course this is something that the Algerian government has repeated many times, is that the Arab Spring has now unleashed a kind of a new threat. And we've got the, you know, Al-Nusra Front in Syria that has links to Al-Qaeda. You know, obviously in Libya, after the Benghazi incident, you've got, and you know, these kidnappers, this unit was meant to have come over from the Libyan border, perhaps, so that there's a kind of new dynamic going on now that at first, of course, the Arab Spring was welcomed, but they're seeing a danger.
Well, in one sense, the Arab Spring is actually extremely bad news for a movement such as Al-Qaeda, because it advocates change through essentially non-violent action. But certainly when you move away from autocratic regimes which maintained very tough order, it gives space for other groups. What struck me particularly about David Cameron's speech was this language that he used. If you're saying existential and generational, you're saying there is a threat to the very existence of your country for the next 25 to 30 years. It's very reminiscent of the State of the Union address that George Bush gave at the end of January 2002, when the Taliban had apparently been terminated as a regime, and he saw the extension of the war on terror to embrace this much wider axis of evil. And in a sense, I think David Cameron was certainly speaking to a domestic audience in the wake of the attack on the gas plant in Algeria. But it speaks of an attitude which I think is actually very dangerous, because it just does not look at the complexities of what is happening. What is happening in Algeria is very different to Mali, which in turn is very different to Nigeria and Boko Haram. So I think if you look at it in this broad way, that this is an existential threat which by implication must be met by very firm military means, I think potentially that is actually very dangerous.
What's actually the threat, though? What might be the kind of threat that we're talking about? I mean, perhaps France saw a threat to its economic interests in the region. Is that the primary threat that perhaps the West is looking at, in your view?
That certainly, I think that may be the French view, because France has such major interest right across what was, in times past, French West Africa. In fact, French Equatorial Africa as well. It has much stronger connections in some ways than, say, Britain has as its former colonies in the military sense. I know Britain does a lot of training in Kenya, but the French have permanent bases in a number of their territories. So I think they do see this risk almost in an almost a crude way of suddenly a move across to a zone of Islamist influence which is completely beyond reach. I think it's actually, again, more complicated than that. And if you see it in these very, I would even say, simplistic terms, one is making the same sort of mistake that was made back in 2002.
Hicham, Yessa, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it's, in a way, interesting for me that the most important issue or the most important element of the context seems to be absent, which is the fact that we've got these countries, I mean, in particular Mali and Niger, which are some of the richest countries in the world, purely in terms of their resources, which have been for decades absolutely at the very bottom of the sort of development tables, and nobody seems. This seems to be taken for granted. The idea that this dimension, the economics of it, seems to be treated as a footnote. I think is very worrying. It's not surprising, though. I mean, there's no question that Cameron's remarks are completely nonsensical. I mean, literally, I spoke to a friend of mine who was an Algerian analyst, and literally as soon as I told him what Cameron's remarks were, he burst out laughing. Nobody takes this seriously, and Cameron knows this. I mean, the purpose of saying what he said clearly is with a particular audience in mind, as I think Paul mentioned, which is simply that you're allowed to say these things because there's no political cost to saying that there's an existential threat, and there's a lot to benefit from in terms of boosting your image as a strong leader in a time of hardship. And one doesn't want to be too cynical about it, but in the context of Cameron's other problem with his EU speech, it's not surprising to me that he's tried to in a way have this whole stance on Mali and Algeria and the Nas crisis to try and sort of give himself a bit of margin of maneuver, and it worked. I mean, most of the media, most of the commentary, even the Labour Party and so on, the political class in general seems to be very reticent to challenge him on this, even though on the face of it, the notion that some armed groups, however nefarious or illiberal their ideology might be, could be a danger to the very existence of the third or fourth biggest military power in the world, thousands of miles away, is beyond ludicrous. It's
beyond, isn't it? Yes, indeed. I mean, a fair point there, actually, isn't it? I mean, in a way, playing the politics of fear and the politics of terrorism. I mean, it's pretty unsavoury, isn't it? Because just because he feels that he'll have the backing of the press and all that on this, it's a fair possibility, isn't it?
Well,
I mean, other politicians have done it in the last decade.
I don't know how. Yes, he misspoke himself. Yes, he grossly exaggerated the sort of threat, in my view. Whether that was because he was still, in a sense, under the shock of dealing for 48 hours with this very difficult and very confused hostage-taking situation, whether it's because he's being told things by his security services which he simply believes and which I would tend to believe would be exaggerations, I don't know. But could I just play the unusual role of speaking slightly in defence of the French here, because I'm not sure it'd be entirely, since all this thing is kicked off by the intervention in Mali, I'm not sure that it is entirely fair to characterise this as a sort of necessarily a neo-colonial thing. Sure, the French have big interests in the area, sure, the uranium in Niger, possibly in Mali and so on, but we've had the whole of the international community effectively in recent weeks and months. We've had a United Nations Security Council, we've had the African Union, we've had the ECOWAS, everybody saying, something should be done to curb the lawlessness going on in Mali. And the European Union's been banging on about this for 2 years, putting a lot of development money in there, which has just trickled into the sand. So I think the French ultimately felt when the movement to the south happened that, you know, someone had to do something, and it was them. We'll see.
Let me just, Nick, maybe remind viewers of perhaps an event in the end of 1991-92 when the Islamic Salvation Front was about to win elections in Algeria. It was, if you want, the first Arab Spring. Some people will look at it like that way. And the French certainly backed a military takeover, a coup d'etat. It wasn't referred to that at the time because they said that they were actually preserving democracy, although that was a play on words, and they did that really to prevent the Islamic Salvation coming to power. In a sense, Dr. Hamouchene, I mean, that's the source of where we are today, isn't it? French intervention there to preserve a pro-French government that triggered a military revolt, an insurgency, if you will, that has kind of morphed in different ways.
Yeah, of course. I think the nullification of the elections in 1992 led to a traumatizing civil war. It was really brutal. It led to 200,000 deaths, and it ended up in creation of different armed groups, the GIA, the GSPC, which became later on as
group for combat
the
and
Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb. But what I want to say is the terrorist groups in Mali right now, they bear the responsibility, the immediate responsibility for the intervention of the French. But they acted like just as a trigger. They do not represent the fundamental cause of the French operations. What's happening there, we need to ask ourselves the question, why has the Malian regime collapsed in such a way? Why is the Malian army so fragile and weak to overcome 2,000 and 3,000 fighters? The answer to these questions will point the finger to the brutal global neoliberal order and the French neocolonial dominations that is maintaining the status quo, perpetuating the plunder and the exploitation and the poverty in these countries.
I mean, perhaps it's just worth saying that Mali is a very divided country, isn't it? The desert parts of the north was where, in fact, the various groups, including Al-Qaeda, had taken over. And Bamako, the capital, is in the south and has always had difficulty projecting power to that area and has largely ignored it. It's been much poorer, so that's been a problem. But let's just try and keep the idea of the kidnapping going now and talk to Professor Rogers. I mean, the thing about Algeria, we talked about its past here. You may recall, of course, there have been rumours that have dogged Algeria from the beginning, that a lot of its involvement in some of these groups, like the GIA, and indeed at one time with the Salafist group for preaching on combat, was in fact false flag operation. Obviously, the 100,000, 150,000 died in the 1990s. We don't know who did the killing. It's so much about Algeria is not opaque. Is that fair?
I think it is fair, particularly to outside analysts. You will get a lot of different views from people from within Algeria with very thorough knowledge. And there certainly have been questions about the possibility of false flag operations, particularly if you go back to that large group of kidnappings back in, I think it was 2003. There have also been suggestions that in some ways elements in the Algerian security forces have been keen almost to support some more jihadist groups operating across the border in other countries, really to ensure that they stay away from Algeria. And I think there is a sense in which the current Algerian security elite do not want to see Algeria involved in any substantial way in Mali, because if the more Islamist groups in Mali are forced back, many of them will come into, or indeed come back to Algeria. So there are a whole range of connections. It's very easy to get into sort of conspiracy theories, but there's no doubt that there are a lot of different things going on, and it is not straightforward in the way that some people would portray it.
I mean, would you say that, Hicham, Yessa, do you think that perhaps the Algerian government, it sort of suits it, doesn't it, to have an Al-Qaeda threat on its both inside and outside its borders in terms of its security relationship with the West, and indeed to prevent Western pressure for it to have any democracy?
Yes, of course, and that's been one of some of the main narratives. I mean, there's been 2 or 3 of them, but one of the main ones that have been quite vociferous in the last few days is exactly that, is people saying from within Algeria and beyond, saying, look, this is what you get if this stability is shattered, and this is what happens if the regime or if the government, the status quo in Algeria is threatened. You will get these sort of things happening, and this will have enormous repercussions for Europe. And yes, I mean, of course, there's some truth to that, but there's other competing narratives as well, because on the other hand, some others are saying that, I mean, we have to look at what is the sort of the discourse within Algeria in terms of the popular reaction to this, which has been as well, completely absent from the coverage here in the West, which is, a lot of it has been worried about the fact that this development in Amina's crisis could be some sort of opening for an attempt to bring some foreign intervention into the region. I mean, nobody knows exactly the extent of the truth of this, but to go back just to the point of the relationship between what's happening now and the Arab Spring and what the connection could be, I mean, no doubt, as one of the previous speakers has said, that the Arab Spring is a big threat to both the existing regimes and to Al-Qaeda and to the sort of the military Islamist threat, because it's exactly the sort of movement that shows that there is a way of bringing about change, radical change, without going through the usual traditional routes of just complete military sort of overhauling of the system.
Okay, Hicham, thank you for that. Well, I mean, let's stick on Hicham Yessa's point then. In a sense, it is true, isn't it, that if you look at Egypt, for example, you've had the Salafis in there, you've had, the brother of Ayman Zawahiri, who is taking part in elections there and, certainly been involved there. I mean, it isn't that the way forward to bring these groups in? Isn't that really the model we should be looking for? And therefore, the pressure should be on Algeria to open up, not to be sending troops there.
I entirely agree. I think it's a great...
But there's not much pressure. I mean, Cameron is taking intelligence from the Algerian security services, apparently believing it and acting on it. I mean, that shouldn't be the way he's doing. I mean, if you agree it's wrong, I mean, maybe we all do today, but that seems to be what's happening. Why?
Well, I don't know where the Prime Minister's getting his intelligence from, but I do entirely agree that one of the unfortunate byproducts of this is that it goes back to securitizing the relationship between Europeans and Algeria. And we go back to looking at them not as we should. At the moment, we should be looking at Algeria as one of the countries of North Africa which talked about moving and reforming 2 years ago with the start of the Arab Spring and has actually done extremely little. And we should be focusing on encouraging them to do that before we end up with another old autocrat dying and no transition arrangements in place and chaos ensuing. I mean, there's plenty of... And we do have leverage with Algeria. They may have lots of gas and oil, but they understand that they need to diversify their economy. They need Europe's help in doing that. So these are the conversations we should be having with them, not as you suggest, the too much on intelligence and terrorism. Yeah,
I mean, finally, we are coming to the end now, but would you agree with that, Dr. Hamouchene?
Yes, some observers have suggested that the hostage crisis in Algeria was a way to push the Algerian regime to get involved militarily in the Mali conflict. But I have three things to say. The first thing is this hostage crisis will be used as a justification for opening another front of the global war on terror. And we've seen Clinton yesterday in that direction. The other thing, I wouldn't disconnect the hostage crisis from the context of the Western intervention. For me, I have no doubt that Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb wouldn't have taken such proportions without interventions in Afghanistan and recently in Libya. And the last thing is that the Algerian regime needs to democratize as there is a serious threat on the sovereignty of the nation.
Okay. Okay, well, listen, thank you, all of us. Thank you, all the contributors. Fascinating debate there. So thank you for joining us. Thanks to our production team. Try and join us again next week if you can for another look behind the global headlines on the world this week. Assalamu alaikum.